Good morning. So today we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapters 1 through 5. So 2 Samuel chapters 1 through 5. And at the end of 1 Samuel, we were moving in this transition from the reign of Saul to the reign of David. And now that transition is complete. So in 2 Samuel chapter 1, we read, after the death of Saul. So Saul has died at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 31, 1 Samuel chapter 31, Saul dies, and now we hear the report to David. And what's interesting about this report is that David mourns for Saul, even when Saul was not really very kind to him, right? So we have this continuing message that David is more righteous than Saul because he is willing to be merciful and to love even those who are his enemies. And what's very interesting about this is that we see a connection in this transition. So we're going to see a similar type of transitional scene or scenes occur when we get to the book of Kings. And we go from the reign of David to the reign of Solomon, and then there'll be a little bit of that when we go from the reign of Solomon to the reign of Rehoboam. So this interregnum, the king is dead, but long live the king, this period between when the two rulers have to, sort of transfer power, is depicted in this way. So David hears of Saul's death, and he hears it from an Amalekite who has survived the battle. And the Amalekite actually went and killed Saul in his place and transfers to Saul the crown and the armlet that he brings to David. And so this is the idea of this scene, is that the possession of the crown and the armlet are the markers of one's rule, right? So when David puts on the crown, when he's coronated, then he will be finally recognized as king. Now what's interesting is that the Amalekite is then put to death in verses 13 through 15, and that's because, as David says in verse 16, your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you that I have killed the Lord's anointed. So since the Amalekite in the scene is the one that puts Saul to death so that Saul doesn't get captured by the enemy forces, he is then executed as a regicide, right, as the one who kills the king. And then the rest of chapter 1 is David's lament to Saul and Jonathan. And what's interesting in that is if you look at a lot of the verbiage there, we're not going to get into it, is there's connections that go back to the song that the women were singing for David, and to the song of Hannah at the beginning of the chapter as well. There's a lot of parallelism in the way these poems or songs were constructed. Now, in chapter 2, we begin this transference, right? So in chapter 2, David is anointed king of Judah. So let's draw our map really quickly, just that we know where we're at. I'll put it here. 2 Samuel, chapters 1 through 5. Let me put my words in there for that. Okay, so we have the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. Jerusalem is basically somewhere about in here. And what I want you to notice is that there are sort of two kingdoms that we have. We have Israel in the north, and we have Judah in the south. And what's important about this is that the two kingdoms are bound together in what's called a common union. A common or a personal union. And what that means is that you have one monarch over two kingdoms. Now, the example we might all be familiar with is Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, right? So the United Kingdom now means the kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Wales, right? And they are all jointly one kingdom. They were formally made one kingdom in the 1700s by the Acts of Union. But before that, someone was the king or queen of England and the king or queen of Scotland. They were two different kingdoms, and we brought them together into one crown, right? Which is presently now Elizabeth II. Okay? Now, What you can have in this is because because they're separate groups, they can devolve, right? They can go out their separate ways. They could have a separate king. And this is, again, if you know your English history, this is the big part of what happens to create the Parliamentary Acts of Union, is that you have Scotland and England trying to vie over whether they want to have the same king or not. Okay, so with that, we're going to sort of erase all of this and talk about the United Kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So what happens is the kingdoms never become united, right? So this is an interesting part about 2 Samuel. Is we talk about the 2 Samuel that it's the united kingdom. But the kingdoms are never united because they're only in union through the personal, common monarch, right? Saul is the king of Israel and Judah. David is going to become the king of Israel and Judah. Solomon becomes the king of Israel and Judah. And then after Solomon, the kingdoms divide because they decide that they want to devolve. They want to go their separate ways. And the northern kingdom will go with Jeroboam, and the southern kingdom will go with Rehoboam, right? So there are two kingdoms, and what we're going to see is that David progressively gains favor, okay? So first, after the death of Saul, David is going to be made king of Judah, and that's because he's from the tribe of Judah, right? So David is a Judahite, by his birth, right? That's the tribe he belongs to. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, which is associated at the beginning with Israel, right? And that's going to create the tension, right? So at the beginning of chapter 2, we have David anointed king of Judah, but Ishbosheth, who I'm calling Ishbaal, becomes the king over Israel. So we now need to talk about Ishbaal for a second. Okay. So we have Saul, and Saul has identified two sons, Jonathan and Ishbaal. And then Jonathan is going to have a son called Mephibosheth. Now, you're all looking in your Bibles right now and going, hold on, my Bible doesn't say Ishbaal, my Bible says Ishbosheth, right? So you might see his name as Ishbosheth. And then this guy's name might be, in your Bible, Mephibosheth. And sometimes there's an H in the end, and sometimes there's not an H in the end, right? Because of the consonants. So your Bible may say that his name is Ishbosheth, and this guy's name is Mephibosheth. Well, I want to tell you a little bit thing about what's called euphemistic redaction. Okay, so euphemistic redaction is what happens when you have a word in the text that you don't really like, right? In our modern context, we use the words like dang nabbit, right? We say other things that you don't say the naughty words, you know what I'm saying? And so that's what happens here. The problem is that these guys have in their name the name of a different God than Yahweh. Right? So the God of the Bible is Yahweh, right? And most of the people have a Yah ending on their name, like Isaiah or Jeremiah, right? And so that Yah ending indicates which God your people, your family worshipped. And so the idea behind this is that at the time, Saul is naming his kids and his grandkids after a foreign god, after the Baal god. Now, what that tells us is that this time, when we have Saul and David in the early part of the United Kingdom, Baal wasn't really a problem. Like, if people could name their children after Baal. What's going to happen is that when we get to Rehoboam and Jeroboam, Jeroboam takes Baal as the god of the north, and Judah takes Yahweh as the god of the south, and then that's what's going to set the stage for all of 1st and 2nd Kings, in which we have this fight over the two national deities, basically. Okay, so what does this tell me? This is why I say Benjamin is associated with Israel. Benjamin as a tribe is located right here on the border region, okay? And so you think, and oftentimes, Benjamin and Judah are usually put together when we're going to get to the divided kingdom period. But what the issue is here is that Benjamin is the tribe with Joseph, right? If you go back to Genesis, right? Genesis chapters 37 through 50, we have the 12 tribes develop. right? And of the 12 tribes, Judah is on one side, and Joseph is the leader of the other tribe, right? That's what the whole end of the book of Genesis is about. It's like Joseph as the king with the multicolored coat goes off to Egypt, his brother blah, 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 blah. He's the favorite son. Judah is the favorite son from Leah. Joseph is the favorite son from Rachel, right? So there's this rivalry in Genesis that's depicted for us between the north and the south. Between the Israel, Joseph tribes, the tribes aligned with Joseph, and Judah, the tribes that align with Judah. And so at this time, in the early part of the monarchy, Benjamin is with Joseph, right? Because Joseph and Benjamin are both the children of Rachel. And so that then depicts why Saul gains his children after Baal. Because the north, their name for God was Baal, which means master or Lord. And Yahweh's and Judah, their name for God was Yahweh, the personal name for God, right? We're going to get a little bit thick in the weeds. I'm not trying, I've got only so much time I can talk about this. But at the time, the two names were either interchangeable or the people had different pantheons of gods they put together. We're not going to get into that. That's a whole longer story. That's a whole another hour of lecture we'd have to do. But right now what happens is, at the beginning, the names with a Baal ending are not a problem. You could easily name your children Ishbaal and worship Yahweh, is what I'm saying. For whatever reason we're not going to get into. Later on, when the kingdoms go their separate way and Israel decides to worship Baal as his own god, or as a separate god from Yahweh, then it becomes a problem. And what we did is we came in here with our little marker pen and we went, and we changed the guy's name, okay? And the word Boshet, which also sounds like a euphemism, but in Hebrew it's not. It's actually the opposite of a euphemism. Boshet is a dysphysicism, right? Not a nice word, it's a bad word. Boshet means shame, right? Like you should be ashamed. You should be Boshet about doing that, right? And that's what they're saying is, because this guy named his name Baal, clearly that's telling us that Saul is not the right king because he names his kids after the wrong people. See, that's yet another piece of evidence that Saul and his dynasty has to, leave stage left, and God is going to go with the dynasty of David, right? And so what's going to happen is we're going to come in and change their names into Ishbosheth and Mephibosheth, okay? So, but originally their names were Ishbaal and Mephibosheth, right? So Ishbaal is crowned the king, right? Why? Because he's the son of Jonathan. He's the son of Saul. Saul's dead. Jonathan's dead. We're going to learn later on that Mephibosheth, is like a small baby. He's like 5 years old at the time, so he can't be king. And so his uncle, Ishbaal, becomes the regent in his place, right? That's what happens in verses 8 through 11. But Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of Saul's armies, took Ishbosheth in your text, the son of Saul, and brought him before the Mahanaim, and they made him the king over Gilead, the Asherites, and Jezreel, and Ephraim, and Benjamin, and all of Israel. So Benjamin and Israel are all together, okay? Now, what's going to happen is the kingdoms are going to be divided for about 7.5 years, right? So in verse 11 it says that we have a divided kingdom for about 7.5 years. And then we go to the next part. In the next part, we have the two tribes fighting over each other. And this is what's going to give us the rest of chapter 2 through chapter 3, right? We have Abner pop up. And so I'm not going to get into this, but this would be a wonderful thing to look at as well, is that you have basically Ishbaal and Israel. And then you have David and Judah. And Abner is his general, and Joab is David's general, and they meet in this place called the Pool of Gibeon. And basically, this is a little bit like the Soviets and the Americans meeting in West Berlin, right? Like, only bad things can happen, and that's what's going to happen here. So Abner says to Joab, hey, let's get your young dudes and your young dudes, we're gonna wrestle it out, we're gonna see who has the stronger army. Well, that goes really badly, really quick. We're gonna skip over all of that. And what happens is that Joab comes and defeats all of Abner's people, right? And they basically Abner kills Abishai, which is Joab's side guy, his right-hand man, and that sets the stage for Joab to really hate Abner, right? So the fight goes really badly. We're not going to get into that. That would be a whole other lesson we'd have to do, right? And so what happens is a little bit later, it says in chapter 3, verse 1, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. These two, it's like East and West Germany, were fighting over the territory. We have this simmering feud. Now, in it, Abner figures out that Ishbaal is not a really good king, right? And it says, David grew stronger and stronger in the house of Saul, that is, Ishbaal grew weaker and weaker. So what Abner decides to do is he decides to switch allegiance and come over to David's side. And when he does that, Joab's like, bro, why are you coming for my gig? Why are you trying to get up in here and be the new guy? Because Abner wants to work for the most powerful king, and he doesn't care what it takes and what it does. So that then brings us to the end of chapter 3. Joab murders Abner, right? So Abner comes over and he tries to align himself with David, and Joab is like, no, sir, you are not going to do that, and he shuts him down. And he shuts him down basically because Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because that he put their brother Asahel to death at the Battle of Gibeon, right? So years after this fight, when we all get drunk at a party and everybody gets fighting, then this guy's going to kill this guy. And when he does, right, so now Abner's dead. When he does, now the fate of Ishbaal is sealed, right? So in chapter 4, Ishbosheth is murdered, right? He hears that when Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard that Abner had died at Hebron, his courage failed and all Israel was dismayed. Now Saul's sons had two men who were captured at the raiding party. It tells their names. And what they're going to do is they're going to come and they're going to go and kill Ishbaal. Right? So now Ishbaal's dead. And in this chapter 4, we learn about Mephibosheth, right? Or Mephibosheth, right? Now Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news that Saul and Jonathan had died at Jezreel came. And his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled, he fell and became lame. Now you're thinking to yourself, okay, so he's 5 years old, why is this nurse carrying him? She's not necessarily carrying him as much as she's pulling him, probably, right? She's gathering up the kids and she's trying to run. Why? Because, go back to the Battle of Jezreel, Saul is dead, Jonathan is dead, and we think David and Joab and all the other people are going to come for the babies, right? They're going to come for the kids and they're going to clean out the house. Why? Because if there are no people in the house of Saul, David becomes king by himself. Because there's no one to be his rival. That's not what happens, right? Because David doesn't kill Ishbaal, and that's why we set up this whole thing with Abner and Joab, is that Ishbaal becomes king because David lets him live. And David lets the son live. Okay, so now back to the scene. So they're running and the nurse is dragging this 5-year-old down. And what happens is he falls and becomes lame. And in the ancient world, that's because he breaks his legs. Right? They don't have urgent care in the ancient world. They don't have casts or splints or things like that. They have some idea of how bones go back together, but the problem is that if your knee or leg breaks in a certain way and we can't put it back together again, then you can't walk right anymore. And that's what they mean there. Ishbaal fell and now has to use crutches to go around because his legs broke and they didn't grow back correctly, and now he's weak. Why? And why is that an important point? He is now the guy who's supposed to be king, right? His uncle, Ishbaal, is dead by, again, another assassination. And now the kingdom's going to fall to Mephibosheth. But Mephibosheth can't be a warrior because he walks with crutches and he's limp. And so what's going to happen is now we're going to set the stage for David to see what David's going to do, right? They're going to come and crown Mephibosheth king, except we're not. Because we find out that David comes and he kills the people that killed Ishbaal. And then he says to Mephibosheth, I want you to come and be a part of my kingdom. Okay? And so Mephibosheth should have been the next guy to be crowned king of Israel. But what he's going to do is he's going to align himself with the kingdom of David, because he can't be the king anyway. He can't go out into battles. He can't be a great warrior. He can't lead the nation. He's not going to be a good representation. And we're going to see in the next units when the alliance, in the next unit we'll see when David shows kindness to Mephibosheth, and what we're going to see is that is the scene in which they seal the trade, right? Mephibosheth comes and he transfers the rule of Israel formally to the house of David by aligning himself to David's house. And we'll see that next time, so I don't want to get into that right now. So, in chapter 5, Ishbaal's dead. So what does that mean? That means David, now, after 7.5 years, is crowned king of Israel in chapter 5. And we again have a personal common union between the two kingdoms, right? David's been the king of Judah for about 7.5 years. Now he's going to become the king of Israel. And he's going to move his capital to the city in the middle, to Jerusalem, right here in the middle. Let me put my star so you can see it on my line, right? So he's going to transfer his kingdom from Hebron is down here in the middle of Judah, to a city on basically the border between Israel and Judah, because he's trying to make a common personal union. He's trying to create a united kingdom. He's trying to bring it together so they form one state together. That's not going to happen, as I'm going to tell you, but we're going to see the movement of that as we go in the chapters. And then finally what's going to happen is David is going to be recognized by those around him. Okay? So I wish I had another color, but I don't. So up here to the north of Israel is Tyre. And the kingdom of Tyre is a guy named Hiram. And then down to the sort of southwest, along the border right here, is Philistia, right? The Philistines. Of course, Egypt's down here, and Mesopotamia's over there, right? So, when David becomes king of Israel, he unites them together. What happens? He does two things happen. Hiram says, hey, let's just make a peace treaty with each other. Put my little peace sign in here, right? We're going to make a peace treaty with each other, and I'm going to build you a house and recognize you. Because Hiram has what's called the Forest of Lebanon up here. If you're familiar with your Middle Eastern geography, the nation of Lebanon basically is Tyre. And he's going to send down all of this nice cedar wood down to Jerusalem, build David a nice palace. Why does he do that? Because that's the peace treaty. I don't want to fight you, bro. So here, let me build you a nice house, and then we'll be square and evens, and we don't have to fight each other. But the Philistines, they don't do that, because remember, the Philistines are the bad guys in the book of Samuel, and in Judges and everywhere else. And so the last thing we see is that David comes down here, and he puts a whooping on Philistia, and he defeats them. And the idea behind that is, with the defeat of the Philistines, they are out of the picture now, right? They are no longer this kind of warring nation that always is going to be bothering Israel and Judah, right? The whole book of Judges, the book of Samuel, the Philistines always march up and they invade Judah or they invade Israel and they plague them and they're a problem for everyone. David comes and he puts the whoop on all them, and he basically quashes them and subjugates them. And by doing that, he then seals his kingdom, right? He's not only the guy who unites the two together just like Saul, but he did Saul one better, and he finally defeats the Philistines. If you remember last time in 1 Samuel, David fighting the Philistines was how he got the power to be recognized as the king that would have followed him in Judah, right? That's what Saul didn't like about David, is that David was one-upping him at every turn. And then this final transitional part, David seals the deal by finally completely subjugating the Philistines so they become his vassals, his servants. And we're not really going to hear the Philistines pop up anymore in the book of Samuel and Kings. We're going to start talking about other people from now. Okay? So that brings us to the transition. We've transitioned now from Saul to David. Everything that was Saul's has now been transferred over to David. Wives, governance, cities, allies, enemies, everything. And we're ready to now begin the united monarchy under David. And I'll see you next week for that.